Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I appreciate it. It's a pleasure to get to address you all again today. And today I'll be talking about my main area of research in the book that I just wrote. What I'd like to do today is talk first a little bit about an introduction. Can everyone hear me okay? Should I bring the microphone closer? Is that better? Talk a little bit about privacy generally, and then I'd like to take a little bit of time and we're going to talk about the topic on everyone's mind, which is the GDPR. And I'm going to do a brief overview of the GDPR, and then I'm going to talk about the thesis of my book, which argues that privacy and design are intimately related and much more important than lawmakers have thus far recognized. All right. So the first question that I think sounds trivial, but is really key to understand in this debate, is we use the word privacy very often in talking about regulatory schemes, and talking about data, and talking about surveillance and social media. But this word, practically speaking, could mean anything. At the beginning of class, every single, I teach information privacy law to law students, and every year when I start, I walk into the classroom and I look at all my students and I say, define privacy for me. And we go down the row and every single person lists their definition of privacy on the wall. And sure enough, if I have 30 people in the class, I'll get 15 different definitions of privacy. And so it's important in these debates, when you're working with industry, when you're working with lawmakers, when someone says the word privacy, it would be good if you got into the habit of saying, what do you mean by privacy? What specifically are we talking about? And honestly, it could mean lots of different things. And so in my own work, I have identified, and this is building on the work of my mentor, Dan Solov, at least 10 to 15 different ways to think about privacy. The right to be let alone, which was articulated in probably one of the most famous law review articles ever written, which is The Right to Privacy by Samuel Warren and Louis Brandeis in the late 1800s. But what does that mean, the right to be let alone? Every single definition of privacy is either over-inclusive or under-inclusive. So the right to be let alone, does that mean that if you bump into me on the subway, that you violated my right to privacy? That seems crazy, but you didn't leave me alone, right? Does it mean that if you call me, if I'm in the middle of an important meeting and you call me and I get frustrated because I didn't want to be interrupted, that you violated my right to privacy? That doesn't make much sense. One of the most common definitions of privacy that I see is the idea of secrecy. When my son was 3 years old, he came to me one day and he heard me using the word privacy a lot. And he said, "Dad, what is privacy?" And I welled up with pride. I'd been waiting for this moment for a long time to explain to my son what it is that my life's work is about. And I said, "Son, privacy is a complicated concept that could mean many different things." And he sort of got confused. And I say, "Well, it's more of like a fluent state by which," and he got confused again. And so I thought about it for a second. I said, "Son, privacy is when you close the door when you go to the bathroom." And he got that, right? He intuitively understood that privacy was about secrecy. But of course, privacy is about much more than secrecy, right? It's about another example, which is personhood, right, or dignity, which are sort of similarly related. If you ask a lot of people from the European Union why data protection is so important, they say that it is a fundamental human right because it relates to our dignity as human beings, right? Information about us, intuitively about us, implicates our dignity. And when you strip us of the ability to protect our data, you strip us of this sort of dignitary rights. But there are lots of things that are dignitary rights that might not otherwise be seen as privacy violations. And so if someone says something inaccurate about you, is that a privacy violation? If someone says that I graduated from Harvard University, which I didn't, is that a privacy violation? Well, it's certainly part of the data protection scheme, but it doesn't necessarily fall into what we think of as privacy. Intimacy, this is one, right? The ability to be intimate within each other, but there are lots of things that might implicate privacy that aren't intimate. So if someone steals your credit card information, is that a violation of intimacy? Probably not. We're not very intimate with our credit card information. Yet we might still think of it as a privacy violation if someone puts your credit card number on the internet. Anonymity, the ability to move without being identified in public. But of course, there are lots of things about people that know us that could still violate our privacy. One of the ones which I'll talk about later is following the fair information practices. This is basically the conceptualization of privacy embodied in the GDPR and other data protection frameworks around the world. By far, the number one definition of privacy that I encounter, and the most common one, is control over personal information. The idea is that if you are given control over personal information and you exercise that control, no matter what decision you come to, privacy has been respected. This is a bedrock tenet of the GDPR. If you look at the articles within the GDPR, one of them says the reason the GDPR was created was to give people control over their personal information. One of the arguments in my book actually pushes back against this idea of privacy as control, which we'll get to later. But one of the newer theories of privacy that we've seen it was created by the philosopher and computer scientist Helen Nissenbaum, which is the theory of privacy as contextual integrity. The idea is that information exists within a particularized context. And when you violate the integrity of that context, when you violate the terms or you disclose it to someone you shouldn't have, then you violated the integrity of that context, and that's when we can identify a privacy violation. This has been a very popular theory in the United States. The Federal Trade Commission has almost explicitly adopted it as the theory of privacy, and it's very interesting, but it's one of the reasons that I don't think it's everything is that it works basically as a diagnostic tool in a lot of ways, but certainly is one that I think has a lot of resonance. And then I'll talk about this more near the end of my presentation, but the three values that I think best represent modern notions of privacy are actually trust, obscurity, and autonomy. And I'll talk about what those mean later, but trust would be the willingness to make yourself vulnerable within a relationship to someone else. So if you, let's say that I'm having a hard day and I'm upset and you come up to me and you say, hey, what's wrong? And I have something very sensitive that I want to tell you. And I say, I want to tell you, but please don't tell anyone else. And you say, yes, I promise. Well, I trust you then with that information. And if you were to tell anyone else, you would violate that trust. And so trust is privacy as I see it within relationships. Obscurity is the idea that most information about us, even if it's publicly available, is practically speaking going to fade away in our memories. So we had a coffee break out here a minute ago. Many of you were having conversations over near the chairs. That conversation wasn't recorded, it wasn't tagged, it fades into the ether. It was publicly accessible, but it was largely private because it was obscure. And we can talk about this a little more. And then the idea of autonomy, freedom from external interference. This is one of the core concepts that pops up over and over within privacy. So anytime someone wants to have a conversation with you about privacy, or they see something on the news and they say something along the lines of, well, that's not private information, or this isn't private, I would like for you to respond with a question, what do you mean by the term privacy? What specifically are we talking about? One of the best models that I have seen for mapping privacy is Daniel Solov's taxonomy of privacy. He wrote this really fantastic book called Understanding Privacy, where he said privacy is not one particular thing. The problem that we keep making with privacy is thinking of it as one particular concept. But he said, actually, privacy is a family of concepts that have similarities to each other. And he maps the sort of world of privacy based on when the particular value or action comes into play. So he talks about concepts within information collection, concepts within information processing, concepts within information dissemination, and then invasions of privacy. And I think that this is one of the most useful ways in thinking about privacy as a pluralistic concept, as a concept that has lots of different possible meanings. And so when you ask the question, what do you mean privacy, you could look to this and say, do you mean surveillance? Do you mean identification or insecurity or exclusion or exposure or blackmail or appropriation, distortion of facts? There are all these things that you could mean, and you risk talking past each other as a matter of policy if I have a conceptualization of privacy as secrecy and you have a conceptualization of privacy as control over information, and we start having an argument over whether a social media post is private or not. It's not secret, right? But if you take it and use it without my permission, I've lost control over that information. So we could both be simultaneously right and wrong about whether that information is private, depending on what we talk about. Okay, so with respect to privacy governance, one of the things that I've done here is I've said there's a series of questions that you can ask in order to help narrow down the issue at stake. The first question that you have to ask is you have to identify what the culpable, dangerous, or ethically challenging behavior was. And specifically, you should plot where it falls along this particular timeline, right? So is the problem that information was collected in the first place, right? Was the problem having to do with how they used particular information? So many people got upset when it came out that I think it was Tumblr IBM was using publicly posted pictures or Flickr maybe, to train its facial recognition algorithms. And many people were upset about that because they posted photos of their family and picnics and trips across the world to Tumblr, not expecting that their photos would be used to train facial recognition algorithms. And it was a big news story, and a lot of people sort of commented. They said, well, this is a privacy violation. And then other people said, no, of course it's not a privacy violation. You posted the pictures on Tumblr yourself, so people can do anything they want to with them. And in order to better resolve this debate, you have to narrow down what it is. Well, it wasn't a problem with collection, right? As a matter of fact, people voluntarily gave over the information. So the problem was either in the processing or use of that information, right? You misused that information. And that's where the privacy violation would come. And in order for that to be a real problem, you have to have your theory of privacy set as a first order. The second thing you want to look is you identify the parties that are likely affected. Sometimes privacy violations occur within a relationship. If I give my information to, if I send a naughty picture of myself to my partner, then that's within a relationship. If I share personal information with Google, that's within a relationship. And sometimes the harm happens when I have no relationship at all. People spy on me from afar. Data brokers get my information from other people. And so it's important to identify that because that's how you help identify who the wrongful party is in any given situation. And then finally, that will help you identify the appropriate legal regime that will address the behavior. Is this a tort? Is this a human rights violation? Is this a violation of consumer protection law? Is this a violation of antitrust law? Is this a violation of data protection law, for example, the GDPR? It could be one, none, or all of these things. And so this is a structure that I sort of offer up as a way to at least help identify and more accurately talk about the problems that we're dealing with in the information era that we all nebulously refer to as a privacy violation. It could be lots of different things. All right, so now I'm going to very briefly review the GDPR, and I call it a review of data protection frameworks around the world. The reason I call it that is because the GDPR has had, as we talked about yesterday, has had an outsized effect upon the world. And so it is, with the exception of a few major holdouts, China and the United States being the two most obvious, most countries that are now updating their data protection rules around the world are more or less following the GDPR format, for good or for bad. There are other options out there, but for whatever reason, actually for a number of different reasons, the GDPR is the dominant model. So I have to give credit where credit is due. A lot of my presentation is actually based on an incredibly useful article by some American and European academics that basically is an introduction to the GDPR. Okay, so the first thing to note is that when we say data protection law, almost invariably we are talking about the fair information practices. The fair information practices were originated in the early 1970s in response to the first computerized databases. So for the very first time in the 1970s, data was able to be stored cheaply, it was able to be stored in a pristine state, and it was searchable. And that gave rise to a lot of concerns. And there were a couple of ongoing committees tasked with trying to figure out what the rules should be to enable fair data processing. And in the United States, the Department of the Hugh report came out, which was a sort of subcommittee report that said, here are some principles that we think are important for fair data processing. And those principles were widely accepted. They made their way into the Privacy Act of the United States. And most importantly, they were mimicked by the OECD when the OECD issued their fair information processing guidelines. And so from the OECD, they made their way into the European, the Data Directive, which was the previous law that governs data in the European Union before the GDPR, and now are enshrined in the GDPR. So what are the FIPS? They're principles. The first one is what we would call the lawfulness, fairness, and transparency principle. Now this one is basically, excuse me, an obligation to act in good faith and in a transparent and lawful manner. This is based on the idea that you should not be processing data in secret. The idea is that opacity of databases is a bad thing, and that we need to be knowing that people are entitled to know how their information is being processed, who is processing it, where it goes. Now that sounds simple enough in theory. In practice, it's very difficult to achieve, and I'll talk about why that is when I get to a different one. Now this is a big one, the purpose limitation principle. The purpose limitation principle dictates that personal data should only be collected for a purpose that is specified in advance of the collection, and that those data should not be used for incompatible purposes. So in other words, before your data is collected, the purpose limitation principle specifies that the company collecting the data should tell you what they're going to do with it and why they are collecting it, the purpose for which they are collecting it. So, for example, if the Google Maps app collects your geolocation, it should say, I am collecting your geolocation so that I can route you on the most direct path from point A to point B. And if they use your geolocation for any other purpose, then they have violated the purpose limitation principle. And the problem is that people try to get cute with the permissive limitation principle, and they say, we are collecting your personal information for every purpose under the sun, and we can use it for whatever purpose we want. The GDPR pushes back against that, but some people have tried to put that forth. The next principle is the data minimization principle. This principle holds that personal data should be adequate, relevant, and limited to what is necessary in relation to the purposes for which they are processed. In other words, only collect what you need for your purpose and get rid of it when you're done, which is also the deletion principle. The data minimization principle could be one of the most robust fair information practices depending upon regulatory appetite. But one of the things that we've learned with all data protection regimes is the regime is only as good as the regulator's interpretation of these principles, because they are broad principles. They could be applied in lots of different ways. The accuracy principle. This is the idea that personal data should be accurate and, where necessary, kept up to date. This seems right. If someone is going to be making decisions upon you, whether to deny you credit, whether to allow you housing, the information should be accurate. So if it says that I have 5 previous foreclosures and that's not true, then that violates the accuracy principle built into within the GDPR. The deletion principle. In addition to minimizing data, the GDPR highly limits data storage. The deletion principle states that it imposes a no longer than necessary standard. So you basically only get to keep data for as long as you need it, and when you're done with it, you should delete it. There's an immediate problem or tension that the deletion principle has raised in the era of artificial intelligence and big data. And can anyone think of what it is? This seemed to make perfect sense in the 1970s. You collect what you need, and when you're done with it, you delete it. But of course, the promise of big data is that you can take data that previously existed and use it for all new purposes to gain insights that we didn't have before, right? In other words, one of the promise of modern AI and data analytics is to take existing stores of data and learn different things from it than what we thought we originally were going to use it for. So Google Flu Trends is an example of this, where we collected all this information that was collected for one reason, and then all of a sudden Google realized that it could use that information to help plot flu trends in the future and predict where the flu was going to break out. The deletion principle runs counter to this, because the deletion principle says, well, you can't just store information for the sake of storing information, right? Because you might need it later. When you're done with the purpose that you specified in the purpose limitation principle, you have to delete it, and that's it, right? So there are many people that say that the deletion principle runs counter to the potential of AI, which certainly it might impose a cost. I don't know if I'm ready to get rid of the deletion principle yet or not, because I think that it actually is particularly useful. And then there's the confidentiality principle. This is the idea that if you should be discreet with your information. You shouldn't share the information with people that you're not authorized to share the information with, particularly if that would run counter to the purpose limitation principle. So the GDPR basically has 3 or 4 major components. One of them, the most important one, is that controllers and processors, and these are people that control how data is processed, controllers should follow the FIPS. Easy enough, right? And what we mean by that is follow all these principles. The next requirement, besides following the FIPS, is that the GDPR imposes... actually, let me back up for a second. The most important distinction, I often get asked what the difference is between US and EU privacy law. The most important distinction between US and EU privacy law is that in the US, you presumptively can do anything with data so long as it is not explicitly prohibited. The default is the exact opposite in the European Union. Automated processing of personal data in the European Union is presumptively illegitimate. In other words, it's prohibited. And the only way that you can process personal data in the European Union is if you justify it somehow. And the way in which you do that is you find a legitimate basis for processing data. Now, one of the interesting questions as data protection regimes start to get modified in Asia is the question of what the default is, because it's not always clear based on the translations that I've read. For example, I've worked on trying to interpret Japan's new data protection law, and it's modeled in many ways on the GDPR, but nowhere in it do I see an explicit prohibition that all data processing is presumptively illegitimate. That might be an interpretation of it, but it's made much more explicit within the GDPR. And so it's important for regulators, I think, to state what the default is. We had a question yesterday, which was how is Google able to take all of this information and use it for AI purposes without people's consent? And the answer is we simply haven't passed a rule that required that Google get people's consent, because the presumption is that you can do whatever you want with data until someone tells you you can't. At least in the United States. The opposite is true in Europe. So the way in which you find a legitimate basis for processing data is one of the following lists. The two most relevant that I want to talk about today are consent and legitimate interest, because those are the two most common that we see. First, let's talk about the concept of consent. Consent serves what conceptualization of privacy? So people talk about, oh, you have to get someone's permission or consent to use this personal information. When we impose a rule like that, what version of privacy are we embracing? Do you remember from the previous? Control over personal information. You can't do anything until I give you permission to do so, right? So consent requirements basically further control conceptualizations of privacy. This is why we have I agree buttons all over the internet. And if you've ever been to Europe, I mean, anytime you go to Europe and you pull up any websites, the very first thing that comes up is what? It's a cookies notification, right? And it says this website uses cookies, and nobody reads it, and you click I agree, and of course nobody can read it, which we'll get to later. And consent is something that is the GDPR uses often, but is very skeptical of. So it's got sort of a weird relationship with consent, because the GDPR says that it can't just be you clicking I agree. It has to be something more than that. It actually has to be freely given, so in other words, completely voluntary, specific. So you can't just say I agree to all the things. You say, I agree to let you use my geolocation information for mapping. That would be specific. Informed. It can't be based on a misrepresentation or lacking important information, so it has to be a knowledgeable consent. Unambiguous, right? It can't be, we notified you of the terms and you kept using the website anyway, so therefore you consented. That's ambiguous. It needs to be a click, I agree, or typing in, I agree. And it needs to be, and here's the big one, revocable at any time. Now, this has given a lot of problems to people that want to deploy surveillance systems in Europe. So for shopping, for example, we want to deploy facial recognition. When you walk in the store, we can target you, we can send you a coupon. It becomes really difficult to offer revocable consent for surveillance practices, but that's technically the requirement. It is very difficult to meet this particular standard of consent. The GDPR has made it such that this is an incredibly large burden for companies to try and meet. So instead, what many companies rely upon is this idea of legitimate interests. right? And in the legitimate interest provision, also known as the balancing provision, it's sort of a catch-all that attempts to recognize the many different reasons why companies would need to collect and process personal information. And so essentially, in the words of the GDPR, processing is lawful if it is necessary for the purposes of the legitimate interest pursued by the controller or by a third party, except where such interests are overridden by the interests of the fundamental rights and freedoms of the data subject. So it's a balancing provision. This is, a lot of the attorneys that I speak with say that legitimate interests potentially applies to everything and for sure applies to nothing, because it requires such a unique balancing. You have to basically go through an evaluation where you say, why are we collecting this information? Is it legitimate? And maybe it is, maybe it isn't. There's been a fair amount of guidance that's been put out, but regulators have yet to get, I think, really serious about identifying what legitimate interests are and what they aren't, because it's so contextual. This is one of the inherent problems with all privacy regulation, is that it becomes very, very difficult to create specific rules about what's permissible in specific situations, because privacy is inherently contextual. And it also varies among a population. So some people might have different privacy assertions than others, even though in a lot of ranges maybe they don't. And so legitimate interests remains to be sort of an area where I would say watch this space if you're interested in how the GDPR is going to develop. One of the key questions that we want to ask is, what is a legitimate interest and how do we balance that with the rights of the data subject? So, okay, so I said that the GDPR basically does three things. One of the things it does is it requires companies to follow the FIPS. It also places other responsibilities on controllers. It requires a legitimate basis for processing information, and then I'll get to the third one in a minute. But there are other things that the GDPR and data protection regimes around the world tend to mimic that require that companies must do. So first, they have to keep very detailed accounting-like records of their processing activities. It is a very good time to be a privacy professional around the world, because privacy professionals come into companies and they say, okay, item one, show me where all the personal data is. And often I hear horror stories of privacy professionals that go into companies and say, show me where the data is. And the engineers say, I have no idea where the data is stored. I can't show you where the data is stored. We don't even know what we're collecting. And so then the privacy professional has to say, we've got some work to do because we've got to create these detailed accounting-like records of their processing activities. 2, the controller must adopt a data protection policy. We often see this in the form of a privacy policy. And this is a long list of what information are we collecting, when are we going to share it with people, how are we going to use it. It has the purpose limitation, it has the data subject rights, it has the encryption standards, it has all of this information that's packed into a policy. It requires controllers to be transparent, even when data subjects do not specifically request policy information. A lot of this can actually be put into the data protection policy. It's a way of being transparent, but sometimes there are things that you have to disclose sort of at the moment of the information collection. Data users must incorporate protections into the technical design of services with data protection by design and by default. Now, this is one of the very interesting innovations of the GDPR. Article 25 of the GDPR said that companies have to institute data protection by design and by default. Now, you may be thinking, what does that mean? And the answer is, I don't know. Who knows? Nobody knows. Not specifically. Generally speaking, we get a sense that you have to incorporate technical, organizational, and procedural, physical safeguards into the design of your product. But basically, the way I interpret data protection by design so far is you have to do all of the FIPS that we previously talked about earlier in the design process. And that's more or less sort of how that gets played out. And I'm waiting on a little bit more, of a clarification of what data protection by design and by default means. Now, one of the things that we've learned is that data protection by default means anytime there is an option, and of course there are options all over our mobile phones and our websites, where you can pick whether something is privacy protective or privacy corrosive, right, or disclosing, then the privacy friendly option has to be enabled by default. So if Google has an app, the buttons have to be turned to do not share by default. If Facebook has an app, then it has to be, the privacy settings have to be turned on by default. And then the user has to go in and affirmatively change them in order to be exposed or in order to share personal information. That's the idea anyway. Although some people say, well, that creates a bad incentive for companies just to not offer any options at all. It's just to just have it be exposed by default. But maybe it doesn't. We'll see. Essentially, there's a requirement that organizations appoint a DPO. This is something that has been consistent now for a number of years, which is, again, why it's a good time to be a privacy professional in the world, is that companies that process personal data have to have a point person. Someone has to be in charge of personal data, and the GDPR explicitly lays that out. If you are engaging in a high-risk kind of processing, you have to engage in what's called a data protection impact assessment. Now, data protection impact assessments is a little bit like the environmental impact assessments, but for data processing. You have to say, what's the worst that could go wrong? What's the full extent of what we're doing? How do we mitigate it? And so it's something that privacy professionals get in the habit of doing. And then data controllers must ensure that safeguards are implemented. This is another way of talking about privacy by design and by default. And they must be key to the nature and the scopes of processing. In other words, they have to be contextually sensitive. That's actually not that controversial. Here's a big one. Companies must notify whenever there is a data breach. This is a difficult one because often the notification has to come, so for example, as early as 3 days. And we don't always know the full extent of the data breach. And so this is actually controversial, but the data breach notification laws are an interesting aspect of the GDPR. Okay, so the GDPR does three things. It makes controllers, it gives them obligations. They have to follow the FIPS and do all of these other things. They have to have a legitimate basis for processing data. And then three, is it creates rights for the data subject. Now, the interesting thing about the extraterritorial application of the GDPR, and perhaps other data protection regimes around the world, is that you don't necessarily have to be a citizen. So all kinds of people, if your data is processed in Europe, may be able to invoke the GDPR. There's a professor in New York who is not a European citizen, who is trying to invoke some of his data subject rights against Facebook in London because the processing happened in the Cambridge Analytica scandal in the UK. And so there's potentially a very wide extraterritorial application of the GDPR, but that's, as best I can tell, I'm talking with people that know significantly more about the GDPR than I do, and I have to go ahead and admit at this point I am not a true expert in the GDPR compared to some people. I mean, I study it, but there are some people that live and breathe it. They say that question has remained unanswered. Okay, so if I'm the data subject, let's say that my personal information is being processed in Europe somewhere such that the GDPR is applicable. These are my data subject rights, and I have a number of them. I have the right to access my data. I have the right to take my data with me in a portable format and apply it somewhere else. This is proven to be incredibly complicated. If many of you work with data infrastructures, you know that it's not like you can just snap your fingers and download all the data in easily transportable form and uploaded somewhere else. The data exists in lots of different formats and lots of different places, and it can be very difficult to find the right way to make it portable. To rectify data, in other words, to correct information about you that's wrong. So if someone has a database where they say that I foreclosed on my home 3 different times and that's incorrect, I have the right to change that data, to request it and change that data. Importantly, I have the right to erase that data. This is, people say that the right to be forgotten is part of the GDPR, and technically it is, but the way in which it shows up is the right to erase data. And if you follow the letter of the law, it's not just to erase data that exists in a search engine. It's to erase all data about you held completely by the data controller. And then importantly, and this one is difficult to justify, but you have the right to object to processing or restrict processing. And DPAs, data protection authorities around Europe, technically have the right to stop processing of personal information all around Europe. And so when you hear people talk about data subject rights, these are the rights. And this is a common suite of data subject rights that we see in data protection regimes around the world. All right, so there's a lot more to the GDPR. I always hesitate to lecture on the GDPR because I give you just enough information to do a very bad job at explaining the full scope of the GDPR. But this is an introduction. I'm happy to answer more questions about it later. But essentially the GDPR requires obligations of controllers, a legitimate basis, and it gives data subject rights. And then there are enforcement provisions. Up to 4% of global turnover, which is a really massive fine. We won't see that, I think, anytime soon, though. The British Airlines $182 million fine is relatively significant. All right. So this is my book. I didn't have a physical copy of the book, but this is a picture of it. So now I just want to take a little bit of time and talk about the topic of my book, which actually relates to GDPR, but it also relates to privacy and global data protection regimes around the world. And in the book, I make 3 arguments. So in the talk today, these are the points I want to make. 1, we should know why design matters for privacy, because it matters more than many people think that it does. 2, privacy law around the world should take design more seriously. Right now, regulators are focused on data, the use of data, who's collecting it, how is it being processed, how is it being shared. But as equally important as uses of information are and actions taken by data controllers is the way in which the technologies, the screens that we're all looking at, the devices that we're all using are built. And we don't have a lot of rules for that. And perhaps controversially, the design agenda for lawmakers, I argue in the book, should not be based in data protection law. As a matter of fact, now that I've extolled the virtues of the GDPR, I'm also going to argue that the GDPR has some serious limitations, and that it's not actually well equipped to combat what I think are the worst abuses of the design of information technologies, and that actually it should be based in surveillance law and consumer protection law. And we can talk about that a little more. Okay, so first, design matters for privacy. So now we're going to get to we're going to do a little bit of audience participation. The reason that design matters for privacy, actually there are 3. Design is everywhere, design is power, and design is political. What do I mean by that? First, design, privacy-relevant design, is everywhere. When I started collecting examples for my book, I started noticing privacy everywhere I looked. Does anyone recognize this? Does anyone know what this user interface is? Excellent. I like it better when people don't know. So, just looking at this is an app. What do you think is the purpose of this app? You can yell it out. You don't have to come to the microphone.
Like 9 seconds to download the photo.
You think, it's protecting against downloading the photo? Maybe. We have the seconds here. What do you think the seconds indicate? Yeah, it's a countdown, right? This is a marketing promo for the user interface for the mobile app called Snapchat. Snapchat was and still is allows you to share photos for limited amounts of time. And you can tell what you're supposed to do just by the sort of buttons, right? You've got your scroll wheels. You can choose how long the picture is visible. You can choose to share it with people, right? It's got the little send button. And if you'll notice the carefully cropped photo, there's a suggestion as to the kind of photos you're supposed to share on Snapchat, which are intimate photos, right? Photos that reveal more than posting on Facebook, for example, or Instagram. And we can tell all that just from looking at it. Does anyone know what this is? Glass. This is Google Glass. Google Glass is they've shelved the project for a little while. It didn't take off, and there was a design decision that Google made that may have doomed the Glass project. Does anyone know what it is? They put a camera on it, right? They didn't have to. You could have an augmented, you could have a screen on your glasses that you interacted with without a camera. But it was the camera that made people nervous. Now, if you think about it, that's a strange thing for people to get nervous about because everyone already has a camera on them at all times, right? So why did glass make people nervous, but a phone on our cameras doesn't? There's another design decision, and that's that you can have the camera readily available. It's always available at all times. Believe it or not, the small task of reaching into your pocket and pulling out the phone and scrolling through and pressing the button was enough of a deterrent to keep people comfortable with having cameras in our pockets. But as soon as cameras permanently lived on our faces, people got nervous. So that's a couple of design decisions that we didn't even think about. Does anyone know what this is? Does anyone recognize this? Does anyone use this? This is the symbol for incognito mode in the Google Chrome browser, right? And it's a symbol that you get anytime you open up incognito mode using Google Chrome. You see this or some version of this. And if you look at this person, it's clear what they're trying to do. They're trying to avoid detection, right? They've got their collar pulled up and the hat pulled down. This is someone that doesn't want to be seen. And if you were to look at this and only see this, then you might think to yourself, well, I'm using incognito mode. No one can see what I'm doing. But of course, that's not how incognito mode works on Chrome browser, right? Now, to Google's credit, there's a long list of people that can still see you, even though you're using incognito mode when you first open it up. But you wouldn't know that if you only saw this symbol. And so symbols, small little design choices, are everywhere that affect our privacy. Design matters because it is power. Every single design decision makes a certain reality more or less likely. What do I mean by that? My favorite experiments done by researchers at Carnegie Mellon is an experiment where they got a number of people together and they ushered them into a room and they sat down on a screen and asked them to answer a series of questions. And I don't know if you can read this, but these questions are, have you ever smoked marijuana? Have you ever cheated while you were in a relationship? Have you ever driven when you were pretty sure you were over the legal blood alcohol level? It is asking you to admit in engaging in criminal activity. Right? So these are relatively sensitive questions. Now, what's the first thing you notice when I pull this screen up?
The design, the logo.
Yeah, there's a little devil, right? And it's not a scary devil, right? It's a cute devil. It's like a little winky emoji devil. Not only that, but also the tagline, how bad are you, right? And it's got the text speak as though like a teenager wrote it. And there's another design decision that you look at, and that's it's written in Comic Sans font, right? And nothing serious in the world has ever been written in Comic Sans font. And so the implication of this user interface is not, have you ever committed a crime? But rather it is, you're bad. Aren't you just a little bad? Everyone's just a little bad. You can tell me. Come on, you can tell me. Now, compare this with the control group, which looked like this. Gone is our cute little smiley devil, replaced with the formal imprimatur of the respected Carnegie Mellon University. Gone is our sans serif font. Gone is our cute little text speak, replaced with just a sort of bland title, a Carnegie Mellon survey of student behaviors. But the questions remained identical. And it turns out, now this is, I don't have the exact finding, but it turns out that compared to the non-frivolous interface, this is the non-frivolous interface, participants in the frivolous-looking survey were almost 2 times as likely to admit having engaged in criminal or otherwise sensitive activity, right? Based only on the design of the user interface that they were using. Design is power. It can compel people to disclose more than they normally would, and it does so all the time. Not only that, design is political. So when I first started proposing my book, a lot of people said, I don't think you should be proposing rules for the design of information technologies because there is no such thing as bad technologies. There are only bad users. I don't think that's true at all. Every single design decision makes a certain reality more or less likely, which means that there is no such thing as a neutral technology. Now, some technologies might be more neutral than others, but all of them are created to act upon our world. That literally is the definition of a technology. It's an artifact created to create some sort of change in our world, right? Design does 2 different things. Design sends a signal. It can communicate to us, or it can make things easier or harder. Those are the 2 things that it does, right? When we create an object, we're doing it to either convey information or to make a particular task easier or harder. And that's it. That's always political, right? Because it distributes power. Computer engineers are some of the most powerful people in the world because they dictate, right? They don't completely dictate behavior. That's technological determinism. But they channel behavior, right, into one direction or another, right? They nudge us in particular directions. Which leads me to my next point, which is that privacy law should take design more seriously. So I teach information privacy law. It's a long course. We meet a lot. It has a long final exam. But it turns out that across the world, there are basically only 3 rules of privacy in the whole world. Those 3 rules all have what I call a design gap. This is something that I think is very common. The first rule is what we just went over. Follow the fair information practices. That's it. For over a decade, for almost 2 decades, the answer to perceived privacy problems by regulators has been, oh, well, you just have to follow the FIPS. You have to follow the fair information practices. And if that doesn't work, then regulators say, oh, well, you weren't fipping hard enough, right? So they just chuck some more FIPS at it. They say you got to do it harder. The problem with this rule, and frankly, my problem with the GDPR, generally speaking, is that the FIPS almost always get distilled down to one particular version of privacy. And that particular version of privacy is the version of privacy as control over information. You got to get people's consents. You got to give them options to delete their data. And so now you may be thinking, what's so wrong with that? I want control over information. Why do you say that this is a bad thing? This doesn't make sense to me. The reason why I don't think this is workable anymore is that the requirements to give people control over information looks a little something like this, right? What is this? It's on and off switch. It's a button. It's a toggle button. Can I collect your geolocation information? Green means yes. Gray means no. Well, again, maybe you're thinking to yourself, why is this bad? This is good. I have control over information. Here's why. Because it's never just one button. Instead, it looks like this, right? So here's the control that we're given, right? I am now gifted with all this control. I can say, okay, I calibrate my compass. I guess I want to do that. That seems good. Find my iPad. I like that. In case I lose my iPad, I want to find it. Location-based alerts. I guess that's good. So I'll click yes. Okay. Location-based iAds. That sounds bad. So I'm going to say no. I don't really know what it is, but it sounds bad. Share my location. Well, I guess that's good. And we go on, right? And so we brew a cup of tea and we work our way through the system. And finally, after some deep thought, we think about it and we say, okay, finally I think I have exercised control over personal information. My privacy is respected. I have been given control. They can do what they want. We're all good, right? And then I take a deep breath and I look back. Oh, I realize I'm never going to see the end of this. I'm going to spend the rest of my life fiddling with buttons that I don't know what they mean. The problem with thinking about privacy as control is that if we are given our wish for more privacy, we are given so much control that we choke on it. It is a practical obligation that is shifted onto users rather than actually meaningfully giving us control, right? In other words, there's no way that we could possibly exercise the control that we're given, which is a recipe for abuse. That's a design gap. It's all done through the design of information technologies. Now, the second design gap in the rules of privacy, right? So remember I said there were 3 rules of privacy. One is follow the FIPS. The second rule is don't lie. Fairly simple. Until you realize that you can technically tell the truth that's really bad and get away with it because no one will notice it. If I were forced to write the location of buried treasure in a place where I knew that no one would ever find it on the internet, where would you put it on every website? In a place that is guaranteed that no one's going to look at least not your everyday consumer. Wouldn't you put it in the privacy policy? Wouldn't you put it in the terms of use? That long, dense scrolling? How many of you are asked to agree to the new terms of service anytime the operating system on your phone updates? Does anyone ever read it? You shouldn't. There's no reason to, right? Or you spend your entire life doing nothing but reading terms of use agreements. It's rational to ignore it. And so design can be used to technically give unpleasant truths, right? Has anyone seen the terms of use buttons that you have to push the button to advance to the next page? That's even more pernicious rather than just scrolling. You got to keep pressing the button over and over, reloading the pages. Design can be used to frustrate the do not lie rule. And then finally, do not harm, right? The do not harm requirements is that we typically say, well, you shouldn't harm people with privacy. The problem is that privacy harms don't often arise to the level of a concrete, tangible harm, right? So your data is breached. Personal information is out there on the dark web. It's all over the place. Is that a harm? Do you have to wait until someone hacks your bank account? In the United States, that's often the stance that they take. But surely we've been harmed by that. Privacy harm doesn't often come with one huge blow. Rather, it is a death by 1,000 cuts. And no one individual cut rises to the level of what we would consider to be a meaningful privacy harm. And so this is another area in which design is used to sort of subtly manipulate us, right, rather than an overt sort of harm. All right. So in the book, I then try to propose a design agenda for responding to privacy law, and I talk about values, boundaries, and tools, right? In order to adequately have rules that promote good privacy design, we have to know what values we want to serve, We have to articulate meaningful boundaries to effectuate those values, and we have to use all the tools at our disposal to do it. You could pick a lot of different privacy values. At the beginning of this talk, I talked about how privacy could mean lots of different things. For me, the most three relevant values in privacy are trust, obscurity, autonomy. I talked a little bit about trust. What does it mean to be trustworthy? To be trustworthy means you are discreet. It means you are honest. And honest is more than just transparent, right? You can put all the unpleasant things in the terms of use and be transparent. But honest means telling the user things that the user needs to know that you might even not prefer them to know. It means protective, so don't store passwords in clear text. And it means, importantly, loyal. You do not unreasonably elevate your own needs over the needs of the user. Right? We call this the law of fiduciaries in the United States, a duty of loyalty and a duty of care. And it's the potential model that we can use that hasn't really been embraced yet. The next one is this concept of obscurity. When information is unlikely to be seen or understood, it is obscure. When you left your hotel room this morning and you walked downstairs and you came to breakfast, you probably were assuming that most people weren't watching you. So if when you're outside and you accidentally walk into a spider web and you're sort of brushing it off your face and you look very silly, you don't worry about the fact that that video is going to show up on YouTube, right? It was obscure. Most people will never see it. Technology threatens that obscurity when it makes things dramatically easier to find or understand. Facial recognition technology is a good example of this. The harm that comes from facial recognition technology when you're being surveilled in public is not that some secret is getting out, but rather the obscurity that you rely upon every day is being corroded, it's being eroded. And then finally, autonomy. We are given choices, but they're not real choices, right? They're not meaningful choices. It's window dressing. It's things that are made to make us feel empowered that don't actually empower us. Because when you're given choices on the internet, you don't get to decide the full range of options, right? You get a pre-selected option A or option B, right? That's not meaningful control. That's choosing from what's given to you, right? And if you're given 1,000 of them, then there's no meaningful way that you can even exercise that control. And so design should, I think, do a better job at that. I want to make sure that I wrap things up here, but briefly, at the end of the book, I talk about how a design agenda should have roots in consumer protection and surveillance law rather than data protection law. And from those laws, we can draw, there are 3 different kinds of design to watch out for. Deceptive design, abusive design, and dangerous design. Deceptive design is design that lies. If there's a button that says add friends, it shouldn't automatically download your entire phone book and send a blast to all of your friends. That's deceptive. And then there's abusive design. Abusive design is design that leverages our own limitations against us. Right? Have you ever seen the I agree buttons that are shiny and red, and then the no thanks buttons that are pale and you can barely even see it? That's an abusive trade practice. And then there's dangerous design, which is things like spy cameras that are hidden that you don't even know they exist. Right? We should push back against those sorts of things. And that's what the final part of the book is. And in the final part of the book, the very end, I actually implement the agenda where I talk about how to implement privacy's blueprint for social media, for hide-and-seek technologies, and for the Internet of Things. All right. With that, I'll stop so we can have discussion until, I think, 12:05. Thanks very much.